Welcome to My Favorite Mystic, a podcast about the weird and wonderful world of mysticism. I'm AJ Langley, and today I'm joined by Pablo Acosta-García. He's Maria Zambrano postdoctoral fellow at the Universitat Autonòmica de Barcelona. His current project studies the materiality, composition, and censorship of the visionary book of sermons by the Franciscan abbess he's here to speak about today, Juana de la Cruz. Pablo, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Amanda. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Well, it is a pleasure to have you. Of course, today you're here to speak about Juana de la Cruz, but before we talk about her, let's talk a little bit about you. How did you find yourself in the academic world of mysticism?
Amanda, you know that this is a this is a very long story, you know.
That's okay. We're just starting up. We got loads of time.
So 20 years ago, when I started my PhD in the University of Barcelona, I wanted to work on medieval literature. And I was interested in general in medieval literature because of the intersections, because of the otherness, because it's a literature that we cannot understand as we understand literature today. I was interested in the orality, I was interested in manuscripts, I was interested in the copy, and I was interested in the intersections between literature or writing and experience. And I think that mysticism is exactly that. As Michel de Certeau said once, the mystic text, it's like, I don't know how to say that in English, but it's the ruins of a fight or something like that. There is a tension between the experience and the text, what happened and what this person wants to be codified, and the mystic text, the result of that. And when I finished my doctorate courses, I met Victoria Sirlot. She's an expert on Hildegard von Bingen from the Universitat Pompeu Fabra, also in Barcelona. And I started to work with her. They have a fantastic library on mysticism, which was donated by Alois Maria Haast. He's the expert from Zurich University. So around 20 years ago, he donated his personal library on mysticism and philosophy. So I started to work on Marguerite Porete, which was my first love in this field. And I started to work on The Mirror of Simple Souls, which I think Marguerite is really my favorite mystic. But today, I'm not talking about her. You need to record a new episode of this podcast based on her work. And I spent 5 years of my life working on The Mirror of Simple Souls, which I think it's an amazing devotional treatise. Perhaps it's the clearest mystical text which draws this itinerary between earth and heaven in the most clear way.
The fact that you describe Marguerite Porete as simple and easy to understand, I find absolutely ludicrous. The first time I tried to read her, I was just like, absolutely not. I can't understand a single thing you're trying to say.
No. In fact, I started to work on this text because I had two options. Angela da Foligno, which I know that you have a fantastic episode with Michael Hahn, and I had this option or Marguerite Porete. And I chose Marguerite because it was difficult. It was a completely hermetic language which I couldn't understand, and I said, okay, this merits attention, and I will work on that. And in fact, I did. After my dissertation, I spent a couple of years more working on the manuscript tradition of The Mirror of Simple Souls. And after that, I started to work precisely. I retook Angela Foligno. And Angela Foligno, this is not true, but it seems easier. It's less hermetic. The language is her story. And there is a first person talking there and talking about what is happening, what she's doing, what she did. And there is an amazing sense of the real life happening in that little village in the middle of the Italian peninsula. And after that, I delved a little bit more in the Italian penitential tradition with Catherine of Siena. And after that was return to Spain and the Spanish tradition, the Castilian tradition. And this is the moment when I found the Book of Consolation, El Libro del Conorte, which is the work of which we are talking today. The thing is, I needed to make this travel around Europe, northern France, Belgium, Italy. I need to know these characters, these authors, these contexts, to come back to the Spanish tradition and to understand that tradition, that mystic tradition, which is very important, and it's very late. In a sense, for me, it was very important to understand what was happening in the Iberian Peninsula at the end of the 16th century with Teresa de Jesus, Teresa de Ávila, Santa Teresa, Saint Teresa, and John of the Cross, and how this happened. Because I think that's a real question, how this amazing lyrical poetry, how this Libro de la Vida by Teresa, this autobiography, were born at the end of the 16th century in Castile. Because when you look at it from a Spanish history of literature point of view, you always find this nationalistic view in which they were geniuses and they they were born in the middle of like an island in the middle of the desert of Castile. And when I make this European tour, I realized that this wasn't true.
Okay, so prior to this European tour, you had only seen these works approached from a Spanish nationalist mindset, but then you decided, because of this, to change your approach.
I decided that this wasn't the point of view you need to understand that kind of religious literature. When you study mysticism, when you study mystic texts, you always need a transnational and international point of view, because this is not only about languages or national contexts. This is about religious movements, and this is about devotional practices which were spread around Europe at the time. And you need to keep in mind this idea of tradition, and I think that's very important. So when I won that Marie Curie fellowship that you mentioned earlier, developing the University of Düsseldorf, my supervisor was Eva Schlottoiber. She's an expert on female monasticism. And my project in Düsseldorf was called Late Medieval Visionary Women's Impact in Early Modern Castilian Spiritual Tradition. This is what I wanted to do. I wanted to understand how this tradition was developed in Castile, especially how these women's mystic texts arrived, these late medieval women's mystic texts. I mean, Catherine of Siena, Mechtil von Hackeborn, Angela Foligno, Marguerite Porete. That's impossible. It will be very special to find the girl Simple Souls in Spain, or I don't know, a trace of it. But this was my point. Were these women read during the Spanish Middle Ages, from the 14th century on? Were they translated? We know that they were disseminated, but how? Could we prove that in any way? And this was my last project, and this was the moment in which I found Juana de la Cruz.
Amazing! So you've already introduced us to a few women of the late medieval mystical tradition, but let's talk about the one we're here to speak about today. Please introduce us to Juana de la Cruz.
Juana de la Cruz, she was a preacher who was preaching at the end of the 15th century and the beginning of the 16th. She was a Franciscan abbess. So we are in a context in Castile where they are trying to reform all the monastic life. So Juana de la Cruz is part of a group of women leaders, which through taking these models of sanctity, which were mainly based on Catherine of Siena, this stigmata, this prophetic preaching, they took this model and they use it to reform the monastic life. So Juana de la Cruz started in a Franciscan tertiary convent under a rule which we don't know exactly which one it was, perhaps the Supramonte, but she became abbess and she started to preach prophetically in 1509, more or less. This is the date in which this convent of tertiaries became Poor Clare's convent. So enclosure was was a new thing there, and they started to perceive rents, and Juana was the prophetic leader of that new community. And I think this political context, which talks about observant reform and the monasticization process, it's what's different in a way. This was a process developed by the Catholic monarchs, so it was developed from the court, and it was supported by them. Juana de la Cruz was a leader which was visited by the court. So the court moved to this little monastery in Toledo, not the States, but in the middle of Castile, okay? And the people from the villages around used to move to the church to attend this prophetic preaching. And this is amazing because I am trying at the moment to reconstruct how these performances were put on the stage, and it was certainly extreme performance.
It sounds like it would have been quite the spectacle. Do we have many records of these performances?
Well, the problem, as usual, is that the things we know about her life come from the hagiographies, and these hagiographies are ideologically always shaped. So the first hagiography, which is called Vida y Fin, we know that it was written in the convent by the nuns, by her community, a little bit after her death. This is something that used to happen in the observant contexts where the nuns were writing their own story, their own chronicle to reinforce their new identity or their renewed identity. So what we know about Juana comes mainly from that source. And that source said that when she was in her mother's womb, she was intended to be a man, but finally she became a woman. So this is a way to explain authority, to explain her charisma, but also to support her preaching. She used to preach in the church, which was annexed to the convent, because she, in fact, was the parish priest of the church. This was a privilege given by Cisneros, who was the Archbishop of Toledo. She used to preach there during 13 years because she was the parish priest. And she couldn't administer the sacraments, but she could preach, and she did it.
So wait, they used this idea that she was supposed to be a man when she was in her mother's womb, but ultimately became a woman. They used that to justify the fact that she is allowed to preach because it is men and not women who are allowed to preach. That's incredible. How did they get away with that?
Because it was not her voice, her own voice, I mean, her female voice. It was the voice of Christ. So she used to preach in a male voice, in a deep voice. It was Christ talking through her. She was a medium. She was a prophet.
Whoa, okay, so this idea that she's speaking the word of God, or that the voice coming out of her is not her own, but that of the divine, that's not that unusual of a thing to be said about female religious and mystics of this period, that they are conduits for the divine word. But this is actually going a step further, and she's actually speaking in a voice that is a lower register, so that it's not really her voice at all.
Yeah, all the sermons start like, and that voice said, or something like that. And that voice said means that voice of Christ. It was the Lord speaking. And this happened in this very specific context because the abbesses had two ways of preaching. And this is Gabriela Zarri's work. One of them is ex officio. This means that they could teach to their community. So they could teach to the community as abbesses in Sacra Conversazione. And this happened inside the convent, and it was something inside the community. But if they wanted to preach, like Juana, to a wider public, if they wanted to preach to people of the Spanish court or the Cardinal Cisneros, or people from the village who were there at the church waiting for their ecstasy, because she preached in ecstasy. This is visionary preaching. So if she wanted to preach in public, this must be a prophetic preaching. And this is the reason why it was Christ talking through her, because she was talking to a wide public, not only for her nuns. And when I told you that the performance was extreme, this is because the sessions used to last at least 6 hours. The sources talk about 6 hours. And in this geography, they say that she used to fall the floor. So the nuns used to take her and put her on a bed. And she started to see Christ, to see God in her mind. And Christ used to approach her and started to speak through her mouth. She was an astigmatic, as I said, so you need to imagine her on Fridays, like bleeding and moving her arms in ecstasy, 6 hours, speaking with a male voice, but not only speaking, because there are a lot of people speaking during these sermons, this performance. She used to dialogue with different voices because she explains the gospel, for example, and she dramatized it. This is a kind of affective preaching. So she changes the voices when different characters speak. She used to sing. I discovered 5 songs in a manuscript. I published them like 6 months ago or something like that. And these were songs which were copied by the nuns. And you can see that she used to sing these songs with different voices also. For example, Christ sings the longest part, and with her own voice, she used to sing the chorus. So it's an interesting performance. And yeah, she escaped from her family to get into this community. When she was an abbess, she had authority problems. And yeah, this preaching started more or less in the times when she became an abbess. They needed a charismatic person there, and she was there.
I mean, maybe it's just me, but 6 hours? How entertaining would something have to be for you to sit through it for 6 hours?
Well, it needs to be very electrifying if you really want to have people sitting or standing there for 6 hours. What I suspect also is that most of the audience was etymologically audience. They were listening more than watching what was happening. I'm trying to figure out where this happens in the convent, because I think that this space, this interliminal space, it's important to understand how it happened, because it was people from outside of the convent. And I think a good place to this performance to happen is the choir, because you have a choir which is connected with the church, and you have cases. For example, you have the case of Domenica da Paradiso, which is an Italian contemporary, also a Dominican in this case, but also a female preacher, also a prophet, and we also have some of the sermons that she used to preach. And in Domenica da Paradiso's case, this used to happen in the chorus. So the nuns were surrounding her in the chorus, perhaps during the office. I'm trying to figure this out. At the moment, the audience was out of that chorus. And when you go to the sources, they talk about hundreds of people like standing, attending that preaching. And I think they listen more than watch what was happening. And this is why it's important, the change of voices and the singing and all of these verbal vocal resources. I think the sound is more important than the sight, because finally she was lying on a bed. And yeah, I think it was a very Franciscan way to understand preaching. I think these sermons were very in the fashion of Francis of Assisi's interactions with people, in which all his body was like a tongue, as one of his biographers said.
It's really incredible. And I mean, I think about audiobooks and voice actors now, where it always seems like a magic trick of some kind to me that so many different voices can come from a single person. But to be a woman in the medieval period speaking about God in any context, even with permission, which was rare enough, the idea of doing that in public for such a long period of time, over and over, the chances of slipping up and saying something that would get you in trouble are enormous. This is a really dangerous thing to be doing in a lot of ways. You mentioned that we have her sermons. What kinds of things was she preaching about?
Yeah. Well, in fact, I think the most basic definition of preaching is really it's a comment on the Bible. And what she's doing in a way is to retell the Bible. And a very important thing we need to understand is that the liturgical vision, it's the way of commenting the Bible. So the vision she's developing is the way in which she is commenting the gospel. She's commenting the words of Jesus. And of course, we keep her work in 2 manuscripts. One is in the El Escorial, the Royal Library of El Escorial near Madrid, and the other one is in the Vatican City. And in the Escorial copy, you find some of these sermons very heavily censored.
Oh, okay. Censored how?
It's not just, I don't like this and I trace a line to cancel your words. it's a complete destruction of the folia, of the pages, of the manuscript. Particularly, this was a sermon on the Trinity, and she makes these comparisons between the Trinity and things, early things, like, the Trinity are three persons, and this is like the breath and the water, so this reader was completely out of his mind.
I imagine so, and it's actually kind of cool that we have this material evidence of someone reacting very dramatically to a scandalous sermon. Though, as a historian, I am obviously outraged at the censorship of things that would have been really wonderful to be able to actually read.
For sure. I'm transcribing that because this was a sermon in this version which is understudied, because we thought it was impossible to read it. Now I'm doing it. And when you read that, do you think about The Cheese and the Worms, that book? Menocchio, who used to explain like the beginning of the universe with the born of the angels, like the mass of the cheese and and yes, for sure, she was making theology live. And the second step this is what I'm doing now, is trying to understand how these performances were translated into writing, because this is a very important step. Yeah, for sure, this is a way also to make the things easier, lighter, because when you are there, you can say things. You can say whatever. And when you write this down in a process which is very complicated, you can make it softer, lighter.
And that's actually so interesting, and comes back to what you're talking about the translation of performance into text, because she was doing these performances preaching in public, and there would have been other religious authorities there. But not only does she say this in the moment without anybody presumably stepping in to correct her, but then it makes it to the documentation. And then it's a later reader that then goes, oh, no, you compared God to things, and then you said 3, and it's 3, but it's 1, and no, you've stepped in it, we gotta get rid of this one. But there's obviously enough people that didn't have a problem with it when she was actually doing it, that it made it all the way from initial performance to documentation, to only then be censored based on an individual's reaction. It is a really complicated process.
For sure. I think that, what I really believe right now is that this book, the Book of Consolation, was compiled and was transcribed for domestic use. It was intended to be used by the community, so it was not so important if it was a little bit heterodox, because it was intended, it was a sacred object kept by the community to, for example, to stop storms, or to heal people with the power, with the virtues of the book. It was a sacred book. It was a revealed book. It was given by Christ.
So even though it was a constructed representation of these sermons and these experiences, it is still treated as a religious object in itself that seemed to have its own divine power. That is very cool. So it's clear that she has a lot of influence, but you mentioned that she wasn't canonized. So what was the problem? What happened there?
So the problem started when they tried to canonize her. And this is a process which has never ended. It's still going. But the problem was they tried to canonize her when she was dead, of course. And in the Vatican, they needed the book because this was her work, right? And they needed to check it. And this is particularly interesting. The problem was not the theology included there. The problem was really that they couldn't prove that the words of this book were Juana's words. The problem was that, for example, Teresa de Avila, Saint Teresa, we have the autographs. She wrote this marvelous autobiography, El Libro de la Vida, the Book of Life, and we have some autographs, different autographs, in fact, different versions. So perfect. This is Teresa's handwriting. We can read. These are her thoughts, and this is perfect, right? But the problem with Juana is orality and performativity. The people at the Vatican were denying the authorship of this book. because in fact it's a book of sermons. And they didn't have any clue on how this was transcribed. Or well, they had clues. They thought, okay, these were the nuns. How the nuns did that? Okay, they took that 6 hours sessions from memory, and after that they transcribed that, and we don't know how they did it. And finally, this was a problem because she wasn't canonized. The process was blocked in the 18th century because of that, because this was an impossible to solve problem.
So again, this comes out of the complexity of the process of taking an experience, which she was having, and which those around her were experiencing by witnessing these sermons, and turning that into something that is then written down, and then attempting to validate it. We're back to the complexity of transmission. It's really unfortunate that that was the stumbling block for Juana's canonization, because it seems like there's always going to be this issue of validation with these kind of mystical accounts.
Well, you know that the main issue of mysticism is the mediation, and the core of the mediation is language. It's a real problem, but finally it's what mysticism is. Mysticism is texts. And these texts are cultural artifacts, and we should treat them as cultural artifacts, and we should interpret them as those. And the problem is the mediation, yeah, for sure. The language, but also the transformation of this very complex performance into writing, and the transcription of the words. And I don't know, it's like in Angela Foligno's case, right? The problem there is the mediation. She's not right with what Brother A is writing. She always complains about that. She says, what is that? I didn't tell you that. These are words, she says, which are dry and without any flavor. And the thing is, that's always the problem, because finally what you have there is not an experience, but a codified experience. And this is a human issue, finally, because writing literature is something different from life. And I started to be interested in mysticism because of that, because it's the essential problem between what I live, what I am, and what can be written from me or from other person looking at me, or the problem between code and experience. I think that's the central issue, I think.
So one thing we haven't actually talked about yet is the scale of what we're dealing with. How much of her work do we actually have? And is there a particular sermon or passage or particular aspect of Juana's life and sermons that you think of first when you think of her?
Well, you know, the Book of Consolation, El Libro del Conorte, is a massive book. It's 72 sermons, 71 in one version, 72 in the other one, 500 folia in one of the codices. And when I think on Juana, I try to really imagine how this happened, you know? And I think this is my point. I really try to visualize, to feel how this happened, and how it was to hear that deep male voice from a church, and how these songs were sung, how the people respond to the chorus. And yeah, I try to put those written words in that context, and I try to imagine the stigmata and how this happened. And you know, how this happened, I mean, not how this happened in the sense of, did she have a stigmata or not? I'm not interested in that. How this happened in the sense of the performance, how the people used to understand that. In her work, in her sermons, she had two different kinds of sermons. One of them are these recreations of the Gospels, in which she makes a new version, more effective, of some episodes of the Gospel. For example, the sermon on the Good Friday is especially interesting because, of course, she was completely amazed with the image of the crucified Christ and how they crucified it. And what she does is to retell that story in the fashion of the Meditationes Vitae Christi, in the medieval fashion, but with very specific details, with very special attentions to the Virgin Mary. Yeah, and this is a meditation tool she's developing for her community. You know, she wants them to visualize that, to experience that in their minds, and you can find the traces of this meditation. Like in the Meditationes Vitae Christi, she said, okay, now consider this, look at this, And this is very interesting for me because it's related with medieval theater. It's related with this retelling of the Bible in vernacular languages, which was forbidden 20 years after that, in Spain with the Counter-Reformation. And she has another kind of sermons in which the things that the community makes, I mean, the liturgical celebration, the singing of the nuns, the model of this is Mechtil von Hakeborn, really is connected with the feasts which are happening in heaven. So this interconnection between what is happening on earth and what is happening in heaven, it's very interesting because she talks about Christ being venerated, but she talks also about people dancing and the angels singing and music instruments and people eating very good food. And the sermons are always based on a feast. The liturgical basis is essential. So what they feast on earth is mirrored in heaven. And what happens in heaven, it looks like a very early thing in a way,
I mean, if you can't enjoy earthly delights while you're on Earth because you're trying really hard to get into heaven, then you should at least get to enjoy them once you're there. It only seems fair.
Reminds me, in a way, to Emanuel Swedenborg's visions. In a way, his other world is a kind of early, very special place. It's another dimension. It's a divine dimension. But Juana's heaven reminds me a little bit of Swedenborg's.
I mean, any vision of heaven that doesn't include cake must de facto be a lie. There is no heaven that doesn't have cake. Seems impossible. We are unfortunately coming towards the end of our time, which means I have to ask you the main question of the podcast. Now, you have actually already admitted that Marguerite Porete is actually your favorite mystic, but now is the time to defend yourself. What made you decide to talk about Juana de la Cruz today?
Well, Marguerite Porete was my first love, and this is the reason she always been my favorite mystic. I mean, not Marguerite herself, but The Mirror of Simple Souls. It means, I don't know, for me, it was a book which taught me a lot. It taught me how to research, but also like in an individual way, it taught me a lot of things. The problem with the first love is that you are your whole life repeating yourself, talking about that old first love, And right now, I really want to start to talk the new things I'm developing right now, So I thought that would be a good way to introduce Juana de la Cruz, and also because Juana de la Cruz was rediscovered by Ronald Sartre, a very good American scholar, but it has been very well studied by Jessica Boone, but mostly has been studied by Spanish scholars, because it's in Spanish, the translation came very late. And I wanted also, part of my work now is trying to explain, to disseminate her work as trying to highlight the importance it really has. Because you got here 71, 72 sermons given by a Franciscan abbess in the middle of Spain. You got the court there, you got the nuns working on the transcription of the text. You got all this visionary work, which, I don't know, sometimes I ask myself, if Juana was French, will she be like so unknown, or if she was Italian, will this book of consolation be so unknown, or is because it's Spanish and it's really in the margins of European literature? So what I'm trying to do now is to put her figure and especially her text in the middle of this European network of female mystics. And I think this is essential, not only for understanding what happened in Spain afterwards, but also because it's really a corpus of sermons given by women at the end of the 16th century. And this is a complete rara avis in a European sense also. This is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to let the people know those writings because they are amazing and super interesting in many ways.
Exactly. And thank you so much for talking about her today, because I think you are right. We do sometimes neglect the figures that fall outside of very specific regional ideas of where mysticism is flourishing in this period. And I think that the work that we do can only be improved by expanding our view a little bit to include the works of other mystics within our framework of understanding.
I think the idea here is the idea of the network and the idea of tradition. You cannot understand these texts as islands, as I said before. You need to understand them as part of religious movements and part of living practices, historical practices. And we should go through the borders in this sense. It's not Spain, it's not the Crown of Aragon or Catalonia, it's not Italy or France. No, it's not that. It's a very interesting network, a real interconnected network in time and in space of works and of experiences and ways of life, which need to be studied as such, as interconnected.
Fantastic. Pablo, thank you so much for joining me today and for telling me all about Juana de la Cruz.
Thanks to you, Amanda. It really has been a pleasure. See you soon, I hope.
I hope so too. And thank you all for listening. You can follow us on Twitter at MyFaveMystic, and join me next time when I speak to Aaron Reich Zoutendam about Mechtild von Magdeburg.